legislation for shared data standards, which I know is very close to my society's heart. So, gents, I'm going to let you get on with things. Obviously, Zarina, you give me a shout as and when if we need breakout rooms, and away you go.
Thanks very much, Nick. And morning, everyone. Hope you've been to a few interesting sessions already yesterday and this morning. I think Zarino, who can say hello in a moment, he was at the Newcastle session just before this. Unfortunately, I couldn't make that.
Yeah.
My name is Mark Cridge. I'm Chief Executive of My Society. As Nick mentioned, we're doing another session tomorrow from our commercial arm, SocietyWorks, which is looking at consequence scanning and how we use that in discovery processes. But today we wanted to talk about, I suppose, how we encourage adoption of data standards and data sharing within local government. And we can talk about some of our failures and some of our catastrophic disasters and some of our tiny little bits of progress that have been made from time to time. And we're really keen to hear experiences of other people from your own organisations. So I'll just, Zarino, do you want to say hello as well?
Hello, I'm Zarino. I'm one of the designers at My Society. So we do everything from the sort of user research, service discovery side through to actual like visual design, prototyping, testing, and front-end development. And that's for, as Mark says, there's sort of, you'll see examples in this presentation as well from both the charitable side, so the big websites that people know My Society for, and also the more commercial sort of service discovery side in SocietyWorks.
That's good. So what I'd say is, rather than going round everybody and doing introductions, I'd say if when you actually come to make a contribution, if you could just say who you are and sort of what organisation you're from at that point, that's probably the best way to do this, I think. What I'm going to do, I'm going to share some slides. I'm going to just talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, me and Zarino, just to give a bit of context. And I would say we're very much, I think we've chosen to do this today from the perspective of an external civil society organisation who may well be a user of data that is generated or gathered from within local government. So that's our kind of sort of rationale for this. But equally, as Zarino touched upon, there's quite a bit of our work is working with local government to help oil the wheels within and between local government organisations as well. So with that in mind, let me just share the screen. This is, as with the other sessions, this is being recorded. So hopefully that's okay for everyone. Obviously, anyone, if you prefer to keep your video off, then that's entirely understandable as well. So hopefully you'll see that first screen.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So first, any questions or clarifications, or should we just get straight into it? So just as well, you know, within My Society, because we all work remotely, we tend to take silence as consent in this situation. So if everyone's happy, we'll just fly straight into it, really. So first of all, what we're going to cover, here we go. We can talk a little bit about who might benefit from improved data sharing, and in our kind of introduction we've sort of touched upon that. We're going to talk about a couple of examples, and we'll start with one that hasn't worked so well and a couple that have been a bit more productive for us. I think I'd be keen to understand from your contributions as well just the scale of the problem, or even the scale of the opportunity might be a better way of putting it. And then we'll get into a bit of a group discussion on some sustainable strategies and what we might do together. With the size of the group, I think we'll probably keep it in one session, although if more people join as we go along, we may split into a couple of breakout rooms later on, but we can decide that later on. I'll also share a list of all the links to all the sites we mentioned separately. So I'll share that Google Doc in a moment, and maybe actually, Zarino, you can paste it in the chat. I can't get access to it for the moment, but So first of all, we intentionally used the word legislating data, and we appreciate that legislation is not always the first port of call for thinking about sharing data, but I'll introduce this as a starting point for where legislation done about, well, 9 years ago, the Localism Act in this case, led to the creation of a number of different things, local plans, and lots of thinking around community assets and so on. And in particular, it introduced the concept of an asset of community value. So this is a relatively niche concept, but it basically means that a local community group or organisation can register a physical asset like a building or a place as an asset of community value. And if that asset potentially comes up for sale at some point, then the community basically has first dibs over making a bid for that asset. But there were a couple of things. Now, we're not going to go into the challenges with the legislation itself, although there are numerous issues with it. It's also quite distinct from similar legislation in Scotland, where in Scotland they have a right to buy, whereas in England they have a right to bid. And as a result, not many assets have come into community control using this legislation. But one thing, so a couple of years ago, we started working with Power to Change, who are a lottery-funded organisation to encourage ownership of community assets, and also the Plunkett Foundation, who really support a lot of kind of local community activity, sort of community groups, helping them get funding and so on as well. And we wanted to, this is a pretty typical case, I guess. We wanted to understand, well, what are we talking about here? How many potential assets exist? What assets have already been registered as ACVs? And has that legislation actually been useful in transferring buildings into community control? And we began a process of, the Localism Act defined, made a requirement for every local authority in England to keep a list of assets of community value that have been submitted by community groups. But that's kind of where it ended as far as data standards go. You know, when you say everybody must keep a list and publish it, that as a result, the 350 odd relevant councils have delivered against that in a huge variety of different ways. There's the classic examples of a PDF uploaded to a website from a link. Some councils have a web page with HTML, and some a very small number of councils have sort of data portals and JSON and machine readable data, and some councils link to Excel spreadsheets and so on as well. But a huge variety of different things. So as we're trying to gather that that's a baseline, we had to go through and first of all find out where all these links were, cope with the different formats we found, and try and drag it all together. So we created a website called keepitinthe.community.org, which we gathered all the material together, and we had to effectively, we started with scrape the data, disaster because of all the different formats. We do use scraping and other services, but it's never a long-term sustainable strategy. We went through the process then of literally manually going through and transferring all this material to one spreadsheet and then uploading it to the website. So we now have a data set of about 8,000 or more community assets, some of which listed as assets of community value, some of which are just community owned, and we brought that in from other research. And so the service we built with Power to Change is starting to build up a really interesting and useful repository of community owned assets or potentially community owned assets, but it's completely and utterly unsustainable. And this is where the problem comes in. The challenge of trying to gather all this information together when it's not machine readable and so on is meant that effectively now every 6 months we literally employ someone to come in, revisit all the council websites, manually update the spreadsheet, and then re-import that data. I don't need to tell everybody that that is not a sustainable strategy, and we're committed to doing it for another year or so. But really, if these type of things are going to be successful, we need more sensible approaches. And I'm sure each of you will have your own stories and versions of this, because within local government especially, there's potential hundreds of thousands of different data points that could be gathered together usefully. But of course, when some of them are very niche, you're not going to revert to secondary legislation to go back and update the Localism Act for something in relation to ACVs. But there might be other places where getting legislation right up front can be beneficial overall. So that's the keep it in the community story. I'm going to hand over to Zarino, who's just going to talk about, and is there anyone from MHCLG or Digital Land Team especially on the call? No hand raising. They're doing, I should say, they're doing some wonderful work. There is, who's that? I can't see everyone, unfortunately.
May,
so.
Hello.
Hi May, how you doing? So they're doing some fantastic work, and they're tackling a very big problem, the planning system and how to digitize it. But they're doing it in a very extensive way, and they're tackling it piece by piece, and they're approaching it in quite a methodical way as well. But this is a huge task, and it's hugely lucrative as well, obviously in relation to the amount of money involved in the built environment and housing, and how we agree the planning process and so on as well. But we were involved in a relatively modest but quite important piece of work last year, looking at a discovery and alpha for Central Register of Planning Permissions. And Zarino, do you want to take over and just describe what we did and the early stage work and why that was useful and important? And if you want me to move on, just let me know as well.
Yeah. So as Mark says, obviously planning data, comparing this to a research project we did on Kitsy, funnily enough, the discovery there around where is the value in this ACV data, it's not very clear. Planning data, it's really obvious. There is a sort of cottage industry of all sorts of data startups doing random things around trying to scrape this data, because just like the ACV data, it's in a bit of a mess. And it's useful at like a hyper-local level. Like, I'm thinking of buying a house. How will the land next to it getting developed change the value of that investment? All the way up to like regional and national levels, where you've got people like MHCLG or district councils or whatever, like interested in spotting patterns and things like that. So we knew it would be interesting. Oh yeah, sorry, Kitsy is keep it in the community. We just call it Kitsy. We like our acronyms at my society. So yeah, we've done this discovery project into sort of looking at how the planning application system works, whether there are ways we could try and open up more of that data at an earlier point, rather than having to do that job of the sort of unsustainable level of scraping and manual collection, and whether that could promote more innovation in the sort of prop tech sector, and support new things to happen that couldn't happen without the data. If Mark, if you go to the next slide, there's a pretty diagram from one of our discovery reports, and we had a bunch of findings that were of interest. I mean, one of the ones that surprised us, but it's one of those things that seems obvious in hindsight, is that we've got a planning system where everything is still predicated on documents rather than like linkable, nice data to work with. So everything is about which document gets submitted at which time, and it's super hard to track an individual property or an individual development through this chain of data. In fact, the more people we talk to, the more we realize that there really isn't even a concept of a development often. And there'll be different identifiers and different parcels of land and whatever. And so that will be a challenge for sharing data. From the word go, there is no model that includes the development. There were other problems around things like publishing geographic data. So there was a fear of breaking intellectual property law or contracts if you share things like UPRNs or derived map data. So often that means that the data gets shared in the least infringing possible way, with like no location information at all, or something largely useless, which is a real shame. And as Mark says, it was a similar problem with the Localism Act for ACVs. There's no mandated format for local authorities or planning departments to release this sort of data. So you end up with a huge variety of different sorts of portals and web interfaces and different formats, different levels of data that are released. Some councils release very little, some release all sorts of different aspects about every stage of the planning process. And there's very little incentive for the big software providers to open up this data or settle on some sort of common data standard. But it was interesting talking to people like the LGA and the GLA, funnily enough, who are doing work right now on like investigating common data standards for this stuff. I mean, the LGA in particular had already published a sort of set of guidelines as to what a planning application data standard could look like. And there's also this kind of active private sector just clamoring for better quality open data on this, so that they can provide services of all sorts of services that are already the prop tech sector. It was amazing speaking as like a service designer, it was amazing getting to see into this world where they're just desperate for this data, and they've got some really cool ideas that could be powered by it. But the question is, how do we encourage that data to get shared, and how do we make sure it's shared in a way that you can build these sort of sustainable business models on top of it? And if the data standard can't be legislated, maybe there are other alternatives to getting that data out in a reusable format.
Cool, thanks, Reno. So just move on to the final example, because we're at the beginning of a new project looking at climate plan data within local government. And so that's one of the main reasons why we introduced this topic today, because there's been anyone who's been at local GovCamp or any of similar kind of meetings over the past few years, open data, sharing of data standards is a pretty common topic. And why we're particularly interested just now is because we're beginning this quite important piece of work. In relation to the climate crisis, whilst a lot of the obligations fall upon national government, so many of the actual beneficial changes required will happen at a local level. Issues around housing and transport, the way we build and use our towns and cities, everything from heating and energy use and so on. Your local government obviously has a hugely important role to play within all of those. And part of the challenge is just understanding where we are currently, what's current carbon emissions and so on, in particular local area. What are the current plans that a local government is putting in place to address these issues, and what progress are we making against those plans? So all of those tasks obviously require good quality data to be able to track progress over time and so on. But when we started to dig into it, we actually found that even finding the plans themselves from individual local government institutions is incredibly difficult. It's no standard format. All the issues we talked about with Kitsy are repeated yet again in relation to sort of climate plans. And when assets of community value you could describe as relatively niche, surviving the climate crisis is a bit more urgent and fundamental. So it's kind of starting to think about how we can really, if we get it right anywhere, let's get it right here is our thinking. So we began a process just for actually helping, an open call to help us find the plans, and we're right in the middle of that at the moment. We're working with Climate Emergency UK, who are a body that represent a lot of local authorities and officers and councillors within local authorities actually working on plans together. We're also working with support from the LGA and hopefully from BASE as well, and outside organisations like Friends of the Earth and so on as well. So we have an open spreadsheet, and again, I'll share the link for this, where we so far have about 251 plans so far. We're still looking for another 121 or so. We're now going through a process of trying to understand which of these are actually up to date, what the format is, where the baseline data is from, and so on and so forth. And of course, again, without now, those of you who are paying attention will have noticed I have something of a Scottish accent, and even though I've lived in London for longer than I lived in Scotland, yet again the Scottish government seem to have done this right. They've actually, we just discovered in the past couple of days, they've actually been through a very intense consultation process to standardise the collection of data around climate plans. Legislation's in place, all the different councils are adhering to that and following the same approaches, which means that they can track and monitor and share progress and learn from each other. And that learning from each other, I guess, is a theme that's always very apparent in local GovCamp and so on. And something that, again, without having established that common language of data sharing up front, it makes that the ability to learn from other local government organisations incredibly difficult, impossible in many cases. So this is why it's kind of, we see it's just a really kind of critical and timely situation to revisit. What we're also looking is, again, coming from the civil society point of view, is thinking outside how we can help marry up the needs of civil society with the way that local government publishes information. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Kate Raworth, who produced the Donut economics model, which looks at a relatively straightforward way of visualizing how we whether or not we live in a sustainable situation where we undershoot or overshoot the sort of survivable and sensible, livable place to be, hence the sort of the donut. I won't go into that just now, but within the Donut Economics Action Lab just launched last week a series of resources for helping cities model how they respond to the climate crisis. So within that, we're looking to try and marry up the taxonomy and data standards they use, and try and align that with the way that local government may publish data as well. So that's a bit of a medium to long-term goal. So just to wrap up that first part of it, we're keen to sort of move in and open up a discussion to think about sort of sustainable strategies, think about what works and what we might do about it. Just a couple of quick prompts before then. Obviously, we recognise that the Registers project was a kind of a hopeful piece of work from a few years ago, which I think arguably, I think it's fair to say hasn't really fulfilled its early promise. I know there was a session yesterday around the open APIs from GDS. So again, I wasn't at that. If anyone was at that and wants to share what was discussed, it'd be useful to kind of pick some of that up. Probably don't have time now, but I would certainly advise you read this piece by James McKinney. James McKinney is worked for Open North and the Canadian government and various others, and he is very influential in the creation of common data standards. He's worked on the Polo standard, which we used for as a way of describing politicians and political legislatures. He has also been working with open contracting and I believe open corporates and so on as well. So some of these big multinational open data projects. But we can maybe come back to that because he's got some really practical, simple advice for strategies for standards adoption, which we can pick up. There's also the kind of approach that, say, someone like Open Ownership or Open Contracting Partnership take, where they develop a standard and then they evangelize the hell out of it. They work with national governments and city governments to adopt the standard, and they intentionally make the standard easy to understand, flexible enough to be implemented in all these different situations, but still common enough to be useful. And they focus on evangelizing about the standard and creating tools that allow organizations, governments and so on to actually adopt the standard. And then finally, there's a new organization, Anna Powell-Smith has just established the Centre for Public Data, which is doing, it looks to be doing some really, really interesting work where she's leading the process of defining data standards so they can be incorporated into national legislation up front. So she's currently working on the forthcoming agriculture bill and looking to make sure that the data standards are well defined and then incorporated into that primary legislation, so that when the bill ultimately is passed, the data standards are built in from the ground up, and hopefully we don't repeat the sort of issues we found in situations like the Localism Act and so on as well. So that's the kind of introduction. Keen to get some initial thoughts and then maybe dig into some of the questions. But the questions we're particularly keen on are there examples of local government data sets that, who's doing this really well? Where is it sustainably being published and shared? This might be quite a short list, we appreciate, but I'm sure there's lots and lots of good initiatives. Understand how does it work, how to get started. If this isn't the case, why not? What are the blockers? We could talk for hours about that, I'm sure. What do sustainable data processes look like within the area of local government that you're involved in? And what's the role of legislation? When is it useful, when is it not? Recognising that in the long tail of potential data sources, your legislation is rarely going to be the first tool you would reach for. But how do we normalise that process in a sort of greater extent? So open to the floor, really. Any thoughts, discussions? You're all very knowledgeable, smart people, so I'm keen to get, and happy to answer questions, but equally, if it's more of a comment than a question, then that's extremely welcome as well. So who wants to kick it off? Silence. It's going to be a long session if no one contributes.
Hello, I'll jump in.
Go for it, Gavin.
How you doing, Mark?
And just if you just say which org you're from and so on as well, would be really useful.
So Gavin Beckett, now product director for PlaceCube, and also associate director at the Connected Places Catapult, where some of that land related data was done. Ewan, obviously, who was on the slide, was at the Catapult before MHLG. Also ex Bristol City Council. So I just wanted to share some stuff from Bristol, really. Some of the things I was thinking about when you asked about sustainable publishing. So I was thinking about transport data as one area. So one of the key things about sustainable publishing is about, can you get the data out of the back office system in a repeatable process, isn't it? Without having to massively massage that data before it gets out to the public. And I think possibly transport data is one of the areas that can be done. And there's several councils that have now got transport APIs of some kind. So when we say sustainable, someone is paying for some work to be done, but there's a service model in some areas now. So, you can buy a transport API service, and that will take the data from your back office system and put it out there to be consumed, by whoever wants to consume it, which is a little bit less difficult than having to maintain, a pipeline of data manipulation, which is what I think has to happen for quite a lot of the other systems. So that's just one example to offer. There are other areas, obviously, but that's one that I'm sort of aware of from the work I did in Bristol. And
that's definitely a good example, I guess, of sort of regularly updating data and so on, where there's an investment of infrastructure is probably warranted and valuable. And also interested for examples which don't change so often, but just aren't effectively become inaccessible as a result. I think maybe there's, if there's any good examples of just the real sort of basic information, just how do you make sure there's a culture of sharing of data in a useful way within local government is really important as well.
One thing I found interesting on the previous session was I asked that exact question of, for anybody who wasn't in the previous session, some folks from Newcastle City Council were demonstrating a How Busy Is Toon website that they set up so that people could check things like how many spaces were free in the car parks in the city centre, how busy the main shopping street was with pedestrian foot traffic during the sort of process of opening up after lockdown. And I asked them, were there any challenges around getting hold of this data? And it was actually, I got a sort of unexpected response from them, which was that there seemed to be the beginnings of a culture there that this data was available, and it was fairly easy for them to get hold of at least the data that they got on things like parking availability and some of the footfall information. So I think it's probably the case that obviously every council is slightly different. There'll be different levels of comfort with and cultural fit with sharing this information within the councils. I think maybe the point at which they start publishing the data is the point at which it gets a little bit more stressful, that at that point you're almost making a promise that this data is correct, and that people can rely on it, and ideally you won't be changing the format or how it's published and all of that over time, which maybe councils feel that's something that they aren't required to sign up to that responsibility, so why should they take it on?
So we've got in the chat, there's a couple of you need to forget, is it Swain Hunter? If you're still, you've got your experience in Orkney in Scotland, it'd be great to hear a little bit about some of that. And I think also Charles from GDS Data Standards Authority, it'd be great to just hear a brief recap of some where the overlap is from your session yesterday as well. Is it? Oh, sorry, I think you can't hear you. Is it Swain? Can't really hear you. No, can't hear you, I'm afraid. Is it just me, or is it?
No, I don't know. I don't know whether he's. Oh, he's there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just about hear you, although you're quite quiet.
Yeah. Okay. Classic Zoom call.
Oh no, can't hear him. Strange.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Charles, if you go first, yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. I'm happy to. I don't want to hijack. You know, I had my hour yesterday, but I was going to say that there are a number of problem pain points here that are reflected by the issues we're having with the API catalog. I mean, the idea here is that, well, the kind of pitch for it is that we want to drive standards through the catalog, that you can't really judge what people are using, who is doing it well and who's doing it badly. Well, well and badly isn't necessarily the right way to put it, but who has got the resource to do it, and is taking that forward, and where does resource need to be allocated. But we see that as driving standards. We're about to publish, well, I say we're about to publish, we're about to start working on the third version of the government API standard, and we want that, which has been quite a centralized thing, to be driven by the community of API producers and consumers. So yesterday was a big pitch to get people more involved from local government, because one of my slides was, we've got, I don't know, 170 APIs on there, and about 20 departments, but only 3 local authorities and the LGA. We had one arrive just yesterday, which is a good example of the transport thing, actually, from the West Midlands Combined Authority, which is a great looking API. It's exactly what we're looking for to get on there, and it's a really good thing to show people what's possible. And this is what, the big pitch around the catalogue is, that you can, you may not have an API, but you can go on there and say, oh, I see, this is the value there. And I saw the session this morning, and I thought that's obviously a very good pitch for the value of this kind of shared data. In terms of blockers, resource is a big one, and that a lot of, especially local authorities, don't have, whether it's because they don't have time or resource to be able to publish these things. They might not always understand what the benefit to them is. Again, this is something we're trying to pitch, and we found that we got a big, when I started reaching out to departments and local governments, we were saying, the Cabinet Office are very keen on this. There's been a letter from ministers, which isn't obviously legislation, but it's very kind of central government giving it a push. I didn't find that necessarily that helpful, because you have to have a bit of a carrot and stick approach. We've been trying to sell this on the benefits rather than, you have to do this for whatever reason. And I think once people are sold on the benefits, and lots of people working the data space realise those benefits and want to both consume data and produce it in this way. I think that it's just a very difficult thing in the government space to have I don't know, publicise the benefits of it. I think so. This kind of thing is really, you know, I really thought that this morning's presentation was great because it's such a great use of data, you know, and it's not necessarily about APIs, etc., but it is very much in that data sharing space. And so, yeah, I should stop now because I'm starting to waffle. This is what happens when you have a prepared speech.
That's fine. As we all waffle. I think we're all guilty of that, certainly.
I wonder if my microphone works. Yeah.
Fantastic. Go for it.
I don't know what's going on today. Everything is melting in technological terms around me. It's the rain, I think. And after all that, really my main contribution is to say I'm no expert in this field. All I've been doing is trying to note where I can see parallels of things that I'm aware of, not necessarily involved in Scotland. And I think it's fair to say that all the data sharing and all the specific planning stuff that you've mentioned, probably the coordinating force in Scottish local government at the moment is the Digital Office for Local Government, headed up by Martin Wallace and Colin Virchnell. So I just shared a link to the planning specific project that's underway in Scotland there, and it's interesting to hear your description of the localism bill, which is something that I hadn't really noticed from this perspective. But 5 years ago, we had our equivalent community interest type asset stuff and powers of, you know, the move from the only being able to do what's specifically legislated for us to do to the situation where we're allowed to do anything that isn't specifically legislated against, as long as we justify it and register it. So on. A passing note, Orkney has been in this situation since about 1974. We've got our own specific Local Government Act, which is all around the establishment of the oil port and so on. And one of the things that happened there was the community benefit funds gave our council a kind of power of general competence right from the start in 1975. So just a bit of curious interest there. But it's just really interesting to see what's going on in England.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and equally in Scotland as well. And yeah, I think one of the key things you mentioned, Dave, is obviously what Colin and Martin have been able to do is Scotland is consisting of a group of councils who have, by hook or by crook, have ended up in a situation where they broadly all collaborate together in common approach.
Right. Well, we've got Scots law to keep. We've got Scots law to keep us all in order, which is distinct from the law of England and Wales. So there is that, and Parliament and so on, government. But one parallel that is quite often usefully made between Scotland is with the 32 London authorities. I believe there's 32 London boroughs. Very, very different geographical organisation, but a similar kind of natural group with very definitely common challenges and aims.
Yeah, and the work, I don't know if anyone from Lottie is involved, but London Office of Technology and Innovation is obviously fulfilling that role in many ways, and that works alongside Theo Blackwell as Chief Digital Officer and so on. I mean, one interesting thing, of course, is, and this is potentially especially true in London, is that the political dimension is potentially quite acute as well. That can both have negative and positive consequences for collaboration across different boroughs and so on as well. But then, when we find it, and again, I'd be interested in other people coming in from different councils and so on, is what's the commonality between? Is there a common approach for county councils? Is there a common approach for district councils? What's the common sort of cultural approach and affinity with how to release just information that may contain data externally and so on, and how you change that culture and how you embed those skills and other common approaches that can be adopted by similar types of councils. I'm sure everyone is well aware that the challenge of segmenting councils and putting them in common groupings is legion. So I'm not going to try and do that on this call. But anyone else who hasn't had a chance to come in yet that wants to build upon it, and Gavin as well, if you had more comments to make. If I cut you off a bit too quick after the transport stuff, please do come back in as well. Mayen from MHCLG, if you want to as well. Sorry, Gavin, go for it if you're coming in. I'm putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, no, but I'm happy to, if Mayen wants to say something, happy to wait. I had a couple of other comments, but it's all right, you didn't cut me off, Mark.
No, no problem.
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, so Sven, it might be an idea for us to have a conversation, because obviously we are planning to do a whole lot of planning reform in this space, and for us, it's very much what Mark was saying. We're not just going to build policy and then force it on local authorities. We want to do this in consultation and collaboration, hence why a lot of the work is actually being done by local authorities. So we've got a group of pioneer councils who's kind of looking at like what the right data standards is going to look like, actually what are the tools that are required. So we've very much done it with the councils. And I think what's unique about what we're going to do as well is that it's not just a policy side of it, we're going to build the systems and the data standards into the systems. And again, this will be done with councils. So we're very mindful of the fact that, yeah, legislation cannot be implemented well if we don't do all of the above as well. So certainly it's approach that we're taking. It's not going to be an easy one, as we all know, but yeah, let's kind of have a conversation in that space, because there's much to learn from each other.
Thanks, Mayen. Gavin, you have a couple more points?
So, well, I was just thinking about some of the sort of history of how this has worked in previous times and what's changed over that period. And I suppose, you know, there was a wave of central encouragement, should we say. It wasn't quite, you know, direction, but it was certainly encouragement around open data. And it was about probably 6-7 years ago, which obviously got a number of data sets published, but it didn't necessarily lead to sustainable publishing. So people pushed things out, you know, due to some of the, you know, the government's leadership on open data at that point in time. Some of the central bodies then disappeared, you know, through the coalition era. But I guess what happened is that councils didn't necessarily put anything sustainable. So a couple of councils or a few councils that had, foresight and forward-thinking teams would have put a pretty good pipeline in place from, you know, the back office systems through, you know, an open data site of some kind, and that pushed out those data sets in pretty good machine readable, human readable formats. But others, you know, didn't do that, and so they just put a very manual, you know, PDF publishing process in place, and there's real wide variability, isn't there? So I guess, although that sort of era of encouragement, incentives, you know, those small financial incentives, for instance, for all those sorts of things, that kind of helped to get things going. It didn't necessarily set strict formats in place. And I know that so when I was working in the team in MHCLG, talking to Paul Downey quite a lot in that first year that it was all set up, and you know, his focus, and has been ever since, you know, has been on really rethinking the, you know, the underpinnings of how how people think about data and policy and all that sort of stuff. You know, so not just trying to reverse engineer the documents, but completely rethinking how the data is created in the first place. So I guess that's critical to it. But you know, it's quite a way from there to councils then actually having the ability to do it.
It's that type of situation where avoiding the actually, I suppose the question I've got is, it used to be, of course, there was some movement for just open data is great. Why is it great? Because it's open, and let's release create data lakes and release all the information in standard formats. And of course it lacked the really critical element, which is a clear understanding of who's going to use it and why. But of course, there's something I touched upon. I don't want to lose sight of it. Is there's just that culture of just releasing your data that doesn't change very often in a way that might not have an immediate use, but aggregated together is useful for bodies outside of local government and so on as well. And that's sort of just the way of, we're all familiar with publishing web pages and using HTML and markup, and they're all standards for releasing information. It's how much there needs to be that sort of education or training or cultural aspect about just good practice for releasing some of the more niche and lower level stuff, that would have helped projects like Keep It in the Community in a way that just isn't possible. And it's a kind of, it's because if we only wait until someone makes an explicit request for that information or comes up with a use case, of course it's often too late. But it's a really difficult one to square, I guess. And I wonder if anyone's got any experience of that sort of cultural change internally, of just where that goes hand in hand with sort of just being more aware of digital tools generally in their work. Anyone that hasn't commented so far? I'm not going to pick on people, don't worry. Or is it all so perfect and wonderful that nothing needs to change, I guess? So I suspect not. So we've got about 10 minutes left, but one thing that I would encourage you to have a look, I'm just going to paste in I've pasted in the slides, and I'm also going to paste in a list of links as well. Just do that now. And within that, the James McKinney piece, the Medium piece, is well worth a read as well. It's just sort of useful if you wanted to get a sort of external perspective of data standards and how to encourage that. And within that, there's he actually come up with 10 strategies for standards adoption, which let me just briefly share that so you can see it. Let's see. Okay, share screen again. And yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different stuff. It's a story he told, a presentation he did. But the strategies for standards adoption you're using, so proof, make sure you know the right people on the inside. Really important one, and we often use for techniques, is building momentum with the illusion of momentum. This is happening, join in, get involved type stuff. And that goes hand in hand with sort of appropriate peer pressure, and also using your reputation as it's been mentioned a few times, sort of landmark or pioneer councils or so on. Those councils who really lead by example within a group or within an informal set of councils can really be extremely useful. Obviously showing use of the data is really great for getting some of the laggards over to your cause, and just obviously respecting the needs of also, I think now, if this was written now, this was done a couple of years ago, I'm sure now it would have to take into account the kind of the rather extreme financial pressures that councils are under, and obviously if it isn't COVID, then it's not priority at the moment. That obviously changes the dynamic. But maybe that's one thing to sort of finish up on, is maybe how the pandemic has changed people's attitude to sharing information internally and externally. Now that so many of us need to work from home, and that's especially true of council staff. The requirements to share information when you're not all in the same place, I certainly feel is going to be a major driver of that cultural change of how information is released externally as well. So, if anyone
Hi, Zarina. We seem to have lost Mark.
Yeah, I was like, is it just me, or is he just gone?
No.
Oh no, he's back.
Oh, no, he's back.
Maybe.
Oh, you got me?
Yeah. We've got you now.
I don't know where I cut off there, unfortunately.
No, right at the end.
Yeah. So yeah, anyone who's been involved in pandemic, how's the pandemic going to change sharing of data now that we all need to work from home and all need to share amongst ourselves as teams? Any thoughts on that? Or was that another session entirely? I'm in danger of creating a whole new challenge. Cool. Nick, anything finally from you? I mean, how has this been useful in amongst the other local GovCamp sessions?
I think it's been very useful. I think actually that sort of idea that you just had then, you know, potentially we could run something maybe in a couple of weeks between us around that whole issue of, you know, sort of how do we share data moving forward.
Yeah.
Now, do we use data? I guess, you know, we've had some interesting sort of sessions over the last couple of days, and obviously one this morning from Newcastle City Council around how busy is Toon, and one can only imagine that sort of stuff shouldn't just be shared in big cities. But I'm just thinking about, you know, I live in you know, we're a town, but we're quite a small town. Yet there's been a marked reduction in the number of people using local shops and happier to take Tesco deliveries and Morrison's deliveries and that sort of thing. And yet at many parish council meetings, there's always complaints about why are people not looking after the high street. And, you know, so even in a little town like ours, that sort of information, if someone could just see how busy was the actual main high street, you know, would be really useful potentially, I think, in people sort of changing their habits slightly to go and shop at the greengrocers and the butchers and the, you know, and these are the things that sort of, I think, you know, our community has responded really well to the pandemic because it's a community, because people are used to meeting in these shops and used to meeting on the high street and used to having the conversations and meeting outside the school and that sort of thing. And obviously to all intents and purposes, those sort of things are now sort of frowned upon because potentially you could be, you know, coming into contact and exchanging sort of potential sort of, you know, sort of bacteria and that sort of thing. But there still needs, I think, you know, to maintain community. You can do it online, yes, but I think our community responded well because they have that community connection offline. And it worked very well taking it online and responding to people that needed stuff and needed support and that sort of thing. So I think anything that can be done around the better use of data, the better sharing of data is a good thing. I think obviously, you know, people sometimes I think are hesitant to contribute and get involved because sometimes it is like sort of, you know, it's a Pandora's box, isn't it? And it's not simple. You know, and I'm not even a techie, you know, I'm just involved in running events and activities and that sort of thing. And I use data in my own particular way. But, you know, it does sound like a very difficult nut potentially for local government to crack. And, you know, I guess it's great if there's people like My Society out there saying, right, well, you know, we'll do all the sort of heavy lifting and get our heads around the sort of, you know, all the sort of policy and bureaucracy and that sort of thing. But at some point you need a group of organizations to buy into it, don't you, and say, do you know what, we'll take this forward sort of thing. So, you know, I guess it would be really good. I'm mindful obviously of time and that sort of thing, but you know, I'm happy to facilitate and get some more people involved. If you guys are happy in spending another hour at some point next week and actually having a discussion, now that people have seen, you know, what you guys are driving at, maybe we could, you know, get a data community together within local within local gov digital as well. I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to Phil Rumans or Ben, and if Ben's still on the call, or and Mayan at you know, sort of local digital office. But maybe this is the sort of stuff that maybe needs more discussion and more input.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm going to follow up with Mayan actually after this as well. So it's kind of, yeah, lots of good opportunity. I think Alex, you had raised your hand. I don't know if that was earlier, but if you wanted to chip in.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Thanks for the session. I did a bit of work years ago with Ben when we were looking at the waste data standards, and we could see, as working with a council at the time, you know, the benefit of getting a standard and all the difficulties in getting there. And but what I was thinking about just today on your point of blockers is, and actually this came up in the session we had yesterday on the APIs. I was talking about clinical waste and that being a difficult area with loads of valuable data and loads of partners contributing to it. And how do you make headway in that kind of environment with that many stakeholders? Thinking about blockers, the blocker we were dealing with there was data protection and the professionals, the legal people who have a say on that. And it's definitely, I think it's fair to say, a new area for a lot of those professionals, particularly in local government, who are now having to grapple with the implications of data, which wasn't part of their day job when they were certainly training and for much of their career. Data protection is obviously vitally important, and there's a lot of people who would love to get hold of our data sets who may not use them in ways we would want them. So I just wondered if there were any thoughts from the group on the dangers and how we handle that.
Yeah, I think there's it's probably another session entirely. I mean, the challenges of kind of personal identifiable data versus general information which would be of use for running and managing services and so on as well. Obviously we all need to consider our obligations under the GDPR and kind of how that changes things. And it's wherever possible trying to separate the two as much as possible so that you can deal with because you don't want concerns about privacy and so on to undermine just good, solid cultural practice of how you release information in public, so it's definitely a way of splitting that. So I think we're pretty much out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for coming along. As I say, consequence scanning session from Martin, another one of our design team tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And lots of other great sessions I think I'm sure Nick may want to contribute to. But otherwise, thanks so much. It's been really useful.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Zarino. Thank you to My Society. This video will be included in the outputs. And like I say, I'll be catching up with Mark and Zarino at the end of this week, and I will definitely commit to running a discussion facilitated by My Society. I think get some more local authorities involved. We can work together, guys, just to maybe get a quick questionnaire out there, find the interested parties. But that was really good, and thank you very much. Good to see you both. Unfortunately, Mark, it's not over a few beers in Bristol. Went on to a salsa club. But we can but dream. Maybe in a year's time, maybe we'll be able to do that again. So stay safe, guys. Take care. We're about to end the session.
Bye.
Thanks, Nick.
Take care.